Good evening and thanks for joining us. I'm Jim Ninsel, host of AZ Illustrated Politics, our weekly analysis and commentary on local, state, and national affairs. On tonight's show, Governor Jan Brewer flexes her political muscle and pushes through her Medicaid expansion plan and a state budget. What happened this week and what's next to come in the political battle to provide health insurance for Arizona's working poor. Plus, the Gang of Eight's comprehensive immigration reform survives its first week of debate. What does that tell us about what's coming up next? And we've got abortion politics, offensive tweets, and much more coming up on AZ Illustrated Politics. But first, a look at today's top stories.
The legislature adjourned early this morning, ending its session after 151 days. Action in the final 2 days made Republican Governor Jan Brewer the big political winner in the session. The $8.8 billion state budget, including expansion of Medicaid, fulfilled the governor's top priority to bring health care to more Arizonans. In doing so, she went against the wishes of most of her fellow Republicans in the House and Senate. And the governor got more. In the waning hours, lawmakers approved Brewer's sales tax simplification program, which she says will make it easier to do business in the state. Municipalities had opposed that program, fearing they would lose revenue, so Brewer compromised and it passed Thursday night. In one other 11th hour vote, lawmakers approved a package of reforms to early voting rules, which Democrats had opposed on claims that minority voting would be suppressed. The governor has until late next week to sign or veto bills passed in these final days of the session. Arizona fire departments are helping neighboring states fight wildfires. Governor Brewer says the state has more than 50 people and 15 pieces of equipment on loan to fight fires in Colorado and New Mexico. 9 fires are burning in the 2 states, charting a total of more than 100,000 acres. Pima Community College's primary tax rate is going up by 2% next year. The increase will be used to pay off debt. It will be about a $5 increase in property taxes for a home with an assessed value of $200,000. The college's secondary tax rate is going down next year. And finally, a correction from last night. We misidentified the finalist for superintendent of Tucson Unified School District. His name is H.T. Sanchez. And that's a look at tonight's headlines.
President Obama has given the green light for the U.S. to supply Syria's rebels with arms and ammunition. Now that U.S. intelligence believes Assad's government has used chemical weapons, we debate the American response with 2 former foreign policy advisors, Zbigniew Brzezinski and Vali Nasser. Then Ray Suarez gets the latest on Detroit's dire financial situation after the city's emergency manager said it will default on $2.5 billion of debt. 6 months after the tragic shootings in Newtown, Margaret Warner updates efforts to push for gun control legislation. Mark Shields and David Brooks analyze the week's news. And we wrap up our week of stories on food security. Tonight, the demand for dairy and what that means for California farmers. That's all ahead on tonight's News Hour.
Tonight on Arizona Week, Michael Chihak looks at the education spending increase in the proposed state budget.
What we did pass in the Senate was very good for education, and what we had was an increase in the baseline funding for our K-12 education to over $80 million.
It certainly doesn't make up for the over $2 billion in cuts that K-12 education has experienced over the past few years.
That's tonight at 8:30 on PBS 6.
This week, Governor Jan Brewer shocked the Arizona Capitol by calling a special session and pushing her bipartisan legislative allies to expand Medicaid to Arizona's working poor. Joining me to talk about what happens next, former Tucson City Councilwoman Carol West, former Pima County Democratic Party Chairman Jeff Rogers, and GOP strategist Sam Stone. Thanks to all of you guys for being here. Sam, Governor Brewer, was she showing leadership by calling for this special session, or was she betraying the democratic principles to which she was sworn to uphold?
Well, it's as cold and ruthless a move as you will ever see in politics. And the plan going into that night was to oust both the House and Senate leadership along the way. And they backed off that. But this is a really, really cold move on Jan Brewer's part. And unfortunately, part of that was that we had a budget bill that had hundreds of pages added to it at the last minute that no one had a chance to read. So not only has Jan Brewer managed to stick her finger in President Obama's face, she's managed to copy Nancy Pelosi's playbook, and let's pass it before we find out what's in it.
Jeff, your thoughts on how Jan Brewer handled this?
I thought it was strategically genius of her to call that special session. It took me by surprise, but the moment I heard it, I thought, hey, way to go, that's what's going to work. And I think that when they postponed the session and we're going to recess until Thursday, that was just the final straw for her. And it's like, you know, we're coming up against a deadline of the end of the month when we have to have a balanced budget. And these leaders in the Senate and the House knew that the votes were there to pass the plan that she had approved. And so the stalling had to end sooner or later, and I applaud her for what she did. I thought it was a very courageous move, and I thought it was a very courageous move on behalf of the 14 Republicans who voted with Democrats to bring this health care plan to Arizona, because I'll tell you what, it says a lot about the Affordable Care Act if one of the three pillars of it is so good for a state and is the morally right thing to do and the economically right thing to do, that a very conservative governor like Jan Brewer would adopt it and force it through the way she did. I think she was very shrewd in how she did it, but it says an awful lot about how good the Affordable Care Act is.
Carol, your thoughts of how this played out?
Well, I was pleased that she was so assertive, and I agree with Jeff that certainly these leaders knew very well that the votes were there. And while there were some budget items that were added at the last minute, I don't think that's any different than any other year. So I think it's certainly a win-win. Society wants people to be covered in health insurance. In this state, and I think in other states as well.
And Sam, how about the political ramifications of this? You had the handful of Republicans who crossed party lines to work with Democrats and the governor on this particular proposal, and then you had a lot of Republicans on the other side who were very upset that this was going through. And we've spoken with Frank Antinori, and he said that he believes that Ethan Orr, one of the only Republicans in southern Arizona who supported this, will be knocked out in the next year's primary. How big a problem do you think Ethan Orr has?
I think Ethan has a problem. Now, the question, he's in a fairly moderate swing district, so we'll have to see what kind of competition arises, but I think this is exactly the kind of thing that he didn't have to worry about until this vote, where I think it's likely someone will come up from the right, challenge him in a primary, and likely knock him off, or at least get on the ballot alongside him and limit his chances via the single shot tactic to get elected. So I think this is a very, very big problem for Ethan a year and a half from now.
And Jeff, when Ethan was running last year, you said that you thought that he was a Republican who could possibly win in that rather split district. It's a competitive district, a relatively close split between Republicans and Democrats, and he did pull off that victory that you thought was possible. How does this play into his future hopes if he can survive a primary? Does it help him, you think, going forward
I think Sam's correct. I think Sam's correct about this. I think that if they knock him off, they'll do it with two. See, it's a House district, so they've got to run two people to get him out. And if they run two ultra-conservatives, then it will be kind of like Antinori and Vote was in District 10, which is very similar in its makeup of Democrats and Republicans. You're just not going to get people that extreme who are going to win that. And so if the Republicans ought to bite their lips, if I were telling them what to do, I'd say bite your lips there and just go, darn, we're going to have to put up with him. He didn't fall in line on this one issue, but we better leave it alone, because that's how you win in a district like that, is a single shot with somebody who's perceived to be moderate on some issues. And so I think if they go as Sam does and they go and primary him with two people, either way, we'll take back that seat.
But Carol, it can be tough to win a two-seat race with two conservatives and one relatively moderate incumbent at the same time.
Well, it can, and I also credit Ethan with another item. He and Victoria Steele worked on the mental health first aid bill, and of course that was ultimately in the budget package. And I think there are a lot of people in that particular district who admire this bipartisanship that they're seeing. So I wouldn't write Ethan off yet. I think he's a cat with 9 lives, shall we say. Right. I think it'll be okay.
All right, and we'll see how that plays out. And we're going to talk a lot more about the legislative session next week when we have a couple of lawmakers in here. But Sam, I wanted to get your take, all of your takes actually, on the biggest thing that happened outside of the Medicaid expansion and the budget here.
Well, I think you can look at two things. I think one, the changes to our elections process in terms of the early ballots. There were three bills there. But the other one is the internet sales tax bill. I think was a huge positive step for Arizona, for our small businesses. Puts us in line ahead of time with federal legislation for taxation, sales tax on internet sales. And I think this was a really good move. It streamlines the process for business owners, reduces their costs to manage this process. And you end up with a system that will be very effective for our local retailers. So I think that's a great step.
Jeff, the biggest thing outside of what we've seen and talked about here today.
Well, I have to disagree with Sam about the elections changes that slipped through yesterday afternoon in the final moments. I think that was actually the worst thing that happened to try to disenfranchise voters, which is what Republicans are trying to do all across the country. If they can't win, they want to disable other voters from doing it. But the best things that came out of this were parts of the budget. We had $80 million added to education. It's the first increase in education funding in 5 years. We had $70 million that were added for child welfare and child protective services. Just those needed to be even greater, but that's a big lump sum to help protect our children. So I think children and needy families and working families did about as well as we could do in this session.
And Carol, your thoughts on the biggest?
Jeff just stole my thunder, because I am excited about the fact that the inflationary funds are there for education. You know, we have more students in school, we need more money. And parks did fairly well. And of course, across our state, that's something that we're very proud of and strong in. So people will have places to recreate too, if they have time to leave the job and do that.
And so. Sam, you were shaking your head when he was talking about these election reform bills, and we should mention basically what it would do is make it illegal for people to go and gather early ballots, and also clear people off the permanent early ballot list. If people do not actually cast early ballots, they will no longer get them in the mail automatically. So you want to respond?
Yeah, absolutely, because every county recorder in the state of Arizona supported these changes to the election laws. These are, as much as anything else, this isn't about disenfranchising anyone. It's about making sure we're able to accurately, completely, quickly count our votes. And there's a lot of confusion out there right now with people who are on the PEVA list and then they're showing up at the polls. Or they take their ballot and they turn it in at the polls, but they're bringing lots of people's, to get back to the other part of this, you have a huge number of groups that go out and collect hundreds of ballots from folks. There's no ballot security. F.Ann Rodriguez, our Democrat county recorder, says it right.
She actually backed it initially, but then she didn't back it after that.
Well, but she said over and over, I was just getting to a quote of hers, that you should never hand your ballot to somebody you don't know. And that's absolutely true. There was a quote talking about this with a woman gatherer for one of these groups who said, hey, during this last election, I went into this woman's house and I dug her ballot out of the trash and we scraped the junk off of it and filled it out. Well, who just filled out that ballot?
I believe that story was they helped the woman dig it out of the trash so that she could vote. I believe that was the story. Let's get the story right if we're going to tell stories.
As you've been very active with the League of Women Voters, your thoughts on these changes?
Well, the League, of course, came out against these. One of the things, I talked with Ann at length about this, and I do agree with her that voters need to be more responsible than they have been. If you have to remember that you ask for an early ballot and look for it and fill it out. And I must admit that at one time I was even guilty of not being as responsible about this as I could have been. I worry, though, a little about disenfranchising voters, but at the same time, it seems to me that we need to be better informed on the process, and maybe there's a need for a dog and pony show. And the League, by the way, does that at some of the libraries. And maybe we need to do more of that to make sure.
A large number of those collected ballots were collected by various groups that were canvassing the Latino vote. And so there's no doubt that Republicans have been trying to disenfranchise minority voters all across this nation, in every state of this nation. And anytime they can do it, they will do it. And that is what this bill represents, an attempt to disenfranchise Latino voters in Arizona.
You hear this claim over and over.
It's because it's true.
Which comes from one university study done over a decade ago of a phone survey. Okay, there is almost no impediment to voting here in Arizona. All we're trying to do with this bill is make things easier for the officials in the state and for our citizens to cast their ballot and have it counted.
And I think we are in the midst of transformation about how people vote.
Right.
The vote by mail thing has definitely snowballed in recent years, and we'll see where it goes from here. And Michael Chihawk will have a lot more about the legislative session on his program on Arizona Week later tonight. I want to shift gears to Washington. The immigration bill got its first hearing on the Senate floor this week. Jeff, where do you think this is going at this point?
Well, I think that Senator Flake and Senator McCain's statements a few weeks ago that they thought they could get to 70 votes is not going to happen. We're seeing poison pills coming from people who are amendments that are basically poison pills coming from John Cornyn, from all manner of Republicans who would never support any kind of comprehensive immigration reform. And what they're trying to do is they're trying to make the path to citizenship illusory, and put all kinds of hard targets in there that have to be met, that may or may not get met, and that may or not be even measurable, so that at some point in time you could go through the 10-year waiting period where you can work and you have this deferred action against you, but you're not yet ready for the green card, and they can go, oh, well, we didn't meet all of these targets, so therefore you're not eligible to apply for the green card. And that's what people are afraid of, and we're going to see a lot of amendments like that are going to be proposed over the next 2 weeks.
And I don't want to get too deep into the weeds of how this all works. I did a long story in the Tucson Weekly this week about how the security measures and the path to citizenship would work in concert with one another. And I spoke with Congressman Grijalva about it, and he says he's willing to swallow what's in there now in terms of the security because he wants to see folks put on this path and have a normalized status who are now living in their shadows. I also talked to Congressman Barber, who's a little more supportive about the security issues on the border, but he's concerned about how these metrics are measured. And I think that Congressman Barber has a lot more to worry about. He did not do well in Cochise County along the border there in his last election. Carol, your thoughts about how our Democratic congressmen are approaching this?
Well, I agree with Ron. I think we don't really know which strategy works on the border. And it seems to me that I don't know how we find that out exactly. I'm not so sure that more border agents are going to work. But I did notice in today's Star that there was an article saying that the Republicans who are so intent upon having this border security were working with the Democrats in the Senate to try to come up with something that was acceptable to both. I don't think we can spend a whole lot more money on other than what's already in the bill. What will we cut so we can spend more money on this? I think that's a dilemma. And I think until this is all settled, we really we'll be in the dark on how to get this 90% security
level. And Stan, the other part of my story looked at how the Republican establishment really would like to see this bill get passed because they want to have a better shot at attracting Latino voters. That's a point you've made on this show in the past. Okay. And do you still think that's important?
I do. I think that's critically important for our party long term. And this is the gateway issue for the Hispanic and Latino communities across the United States. And there's no consensus even within those communities on what the right thing to do in terms of border security, legalization, path to legalization is. But when you start out every conversation by saying, we don't want those people here, send them home, you're going to get exactly the reaction we saw at the ballot this past year, which is an overwhelmingly negative turnout against you. So that has to change. Fortunately, so far, the Gang of Eight has managed to fend off most of those amendments and to keep them out of the bill and keep it essentially relatively unchanged. There's plenty of money in the bill, more than I really feel we need for border security. I've worked now 3 consecutive election cycles in Ron Barber's district, which includes Cochise County and the border. I've spent time, had dinner with all the ranchers down there. I've spoken with those people directly. A lot of this problem comes down to how we address it, how we manage it, Border Patrol union rules versus the kind of the reality of working on a massive open border, those sorts of things. As even Raul Grijalva said, getting the Border Patrol out of the middle of the country and putting them on the border so that our resources are deployed where they're supposed to be. I think if you did those things, we can have excellent border security. It's never been a matter of the inability to secure our border. It's always been a matter of the lack of political will.
I will say one thing that this has the potential to do, just like we saw the Medicaid expansion on a more local level really drive a wedge into the Republican Party, this has the potential of doing that, because some of these people like John Cornyn and Jeff Sessions and many others, they're diehard anti-immigration reform, and they are not, the only thing they will do in the committee process or in the floor right now is offer poison pill amendments. And so if they don't get their way, and then we see what happens in the House where there are a lot more of them, and they could force it to be one of those the majority rules, the Hastert rules that they call it, before they'll let it come to a vote. So this could be very divisive for the Republican Party.
And Boehner's been signaling that he probably will not invoke the Hastert rule on this, but we'll have to wait and see first what gets out of the Senate and then what comes to the House. So a lot to watch on that front. Sam, Congressman Trent Franks this week got a lot of national attention when he made some more comments about rape and abortion and pregnancy. What did you make of Franks' comments?
It was pure idiocy. Can one of our elected officials learn when they get asked these questions not to answer them? Because as a PR guy, I'm really sick of these stupid answers to these things. It's absurd. To say these kind of callous things about a woman who's been raped, based on no scientific fact or anything of the sort, is insane and stupid. And Trent Franks needs to know that that is totally unacceptable.
And Carol, your thoughts?
Well, I'm outraged. Here we go again. You would think that he would have learned from Todd Akin in Missouri, but apparently not. And
Richard Murdoch, too. We've got more than one example for him to go on.
Thank you. There are 2 bad examples. And, you can be intent and emotional about an issue, but you better mind your P's and Q's and stick to the facts, for heaven's sakes. This is not scientific. It can't be scientifically proven. And some of the women in that committee pointed that out, not too kindly, as well they should.
And the congressman did try to walk back his comments and clarify what he was trying to say, Jeff, but it was all related to some bill that's going to prohibit abortion after 20 weeks, a federal bill. And what's going on with that legislation?
Well, that's patently unconstitutional. I mean, various states are trying to enact it. Arizona enacted it as well as a state law. It was put on hold by the federal court. Already there's an injunction against it. So it's patently unconstitutional. 23 to 24 weeks is where viability attaches, and Roe v. Wade talks about viability as being the marker of when the state can begin to regulate abortions like that. So it's patently unconstitutional, and they shouldn't have even brought it to the floor. If I were advising the Republicans what to do, I mean, they've shown themselves for so long lately as a party that looks like it can't evolve on women's issues, that I would tell people like Trent Franks, don't bring that bill to the floor. It's unconstitutional. It's going to create bad press. Even if he doesn't say something really stupid like that, it's still going to create bad press for the Republican Party with women voters. So,
well, it does create bad press, and I wish he'd just shut up and not say it. But when you're speaking to the issue here, what we're finding out is that with modern medical technology, the evolution of modern medical technology, viability is becoming earlier and earlier in the pregnancy process. No, it's still not earlier
than 23 or 24 weeks.
But it is moving in that direction pretty consistently.
Bill is based on the theory that the fetus feels pain. That's the argument that they're making for it. They're not arguing that a fetus is viable at 20 weeks. They're arguing that it's about the fetus feeling pain.
Well, but you have examples now of fetuses that have been viable at 21, 22 weeks. It's unusual, but it happens.
All right, and Jeff, I wanted to ask you about Senator Jeff Flake. His son made headlines this week. The senator had to apologize because of some very offensive tweets and other online activity that his teenage son was responsible for. Your thoughts here?
Well, he made some remarks that were homophobic, a homosexual slur, made an anti-Semitic comment, and as well as made some racist comments about Hispanics or Latinos. And my first thought right off the bat was, well, he's a 15-year-old kid. We all did stupid things when we were 15 years old. But the more I think about it, the more I think, you absorb the attitudes of the crowds you run in. And there is a small segment of the Republican Party, it's a decent-sized one that they've appealed to since the 60s and their Southern strategy for trying to win the presidency, that basically appeals to people who have these kinds of attitudes. And until they can purge themselves of these kinds of attitudes, the Republican Party's in deep trouble. You saw that sort of autopsy done by the young Republicans recently, where they said, the money line was, we're seeing the Republican Party, as people are seeing it, and particularly young people, as racist and rigid and homophobic, and so I have to wonder where he comes up with these kinds of ideas for a young man like that, and maybe it's the circles that he travels in.
Sam, your thoughts on that one?
I was shocked. I haven't met Jeff's son, but obviously I've met the senator a number of times. I've met his wife a number of times. And they're fantastic people. This is the last thing I would expect from a member of their family. But this was way over the top. This wasn't, if there was one, you referred to the anti-Semitic comment, that was kind of actually, as a Jew, that was actually kind of funny. But everything else was way over the top and just abhorrent. And I'm completely at a loss about what to say on that, except that Jeff's explanation that he sat down and had a chat with him and he apologized, honestly, in this case, I'm not sure that's good enough. This is, I think, a kid who needs to get out and spend some more time out in the community dealing with some different people at this point.
It definitely isn't good enough. If he were my kid, his smartphone would be put away and he wouldn't get it back until he could behave responsibly. I think a little community service at a homeless shelter, God knows there are plenty of those in D.C., this summer might be just the ticket.
And Carol, we got our first look at the TUSD candidate for superintendent, and we're down to 1 minute, unfortunately, but you attended the forum. Your thoughts on what you saw there?
Well, I thought that I'm troubled by his inexperience, but at the same time, he was very communicative. He has a good sense of humor. I think that we'll see how well he does. Time will tell.
Jeff, you?
He seemed intelligent and articulate. I was troubled by some of the religious things that he said. In one passage, he seemed to view creationism and evolution as being equivalent, and I was a little troubled by that. I hope it was just a misstatement, but he seems, I'm cautiously optimistic. Put it that way.
15 seconds on.
I just wish we'd had a little bit more public process and more than one finalist.
I agree.
Yeah,
Yes.
I think that's one of the things that people are certainly concerned about. Well, again, Arizona Week tonight, we will have a lot more on the legislative session, and that is where we will have to leave things. I thank you guys for being here. I will be right back with some final thoughts. That's our show for tonight, but you can learn more about politics by visiting azpm.org or by following us on Facebook and Twitter. I'm Jim Ninsel. Thanks for watching another edition of AZ Illustrated Politics.